starting with thesis prep, I sort of went in like 4 tangents of my research. First, I was looking into, set design in theatrical plays, the props and the relation to the scenography and the spectator experiencing the whole ensemble, followed by contemporary embodiments of scenography. So looking into Diller Scafidio's Mile-Long Opera, and basically how the relationship of the High Line to this dynamic event that kind of makes the High Line as an urban stage where the performers are distributed and the audience can traverse through the space, sort of where the city becomes the protagonist as well as the backdrop of the cumulative experience. And then in the process, I also took keen interest in researching on children's pop-up books. And the idea of, the ephemeral quality of as you turn the page and things unfold, and the ephemeral quality and how that could potentially be related to ephemeral Foley-esque pieces that then inform my project. And then also as like studying the grid and like the idea of having like multiple Foleys and the relationship of like each Foley being its autonomous element, but also having a collective dialogue. I was looking into Bernard Shumi's Parc de la Villette and the grid-like system of autonomous Foleys. And then after that, the project sort of started getting together. I decided on a site in New York. It's Hunters Point, Long Island. It's, if some of you might already know this, Weissman Freddy, the architecture, it's really big architecture firm in the US. They're trying to revamp this abandoned waterfront to, trying to invigorate it as a public space. So kind of taking this site and then moving forward, I can show you the master plan. I sort of divided it up into like 5 major follies or monumental pieces, as you would want to call it, that are spread out for the whole length of the site. And then each of these pieces sort of fold, unfold, turn, rotate to accommodate seating or, act as a backdrop scenery of some sort. Some of them frame the city of New York in different ways. Some of it celebrates, the culture, the diversity. And also each of these pieces sort of have a story of their own. I sort of divided up into like 5 broader concepts. Like one of them is called the confessional, where you see like this idea of like really big space followed by, spaces within spaces, and the idea of like domestic solace versus outdoor space. And so like some of these popped up elements sort of show sceneries of like, like Brooklyn Bridge, or like, like a domestic closet versus like, the wilderness. And all of these are kind of strategically placed so that when they're folded, like when they're collapsed on the ground, there are sort of these passageways, or just like these pieces that are sitting as like ruins almost. And then when the follies sort of pop up, they each have like a story of their own. So then it's like the playground, which is like more of like a playful, like bustling Times Square, New York, versus like taking New York skyline and comparing it to like a theatrical stage and having like these collapsed furniture pieces spread around. So it's like this playful area. I only showed 2 of these. I have all the others in progress. I just haven't rendered them yet. So it's just like all the others are like, there's one, this is like, it's called a mimicry, which is essentially capturing the different sounds of New York. So it's like these little passages that you go through, in each passage, like one would be like by Times Square, and like you hear like the car honks, versus like you're by Coney Island, and like you could feel like the sound of the water hitting the shores, etc. This is from miniatures, where I did like specifically worked on one of the pieces, which was a playground. Sort of showing you the video of like how the collapsed versus folded up pieces would look like. So yeah, I think that's where I'm at right now. I don't know. I guess that's it.
Thanks, Shri. I think you can unshare and then pass the mic.
Okay. Yeah.
Thanks, Shri. Yeah,
Yeah,
your work is really beautiful. I'm not very familiar with what you're doing, but super glad to see it.
thank
And
you.
I see a lot of overlaps actually between the stuff that we're uh, looking at. So I think we'll have a
Okay.
good conversation. I'm on my phone, so I won't share my screen, but you can follow along on the Miro board if you're there. It's going to be from the top right, or top left rather, and we'll do a little figure eight sort of down through the process. So just briefly to walk you into the project, I really started off with a fascination with monuments in our city, and especially how some large things get built. And in the way that they get built, they have this back face to them, like looking at the back of somebody's head. And I was really interested in the urban spaces that result from that. So I started off with looking at some iconic buildings like Coop Himmelblau's building along the 5 and Rafael Meneo's cathedral on the other side of that. And from there, I started rethinking about what sort of monuments exist in our city and which ones we should be looking at as a territory for designing. And I moved a little further south in Los Angeles along the 5 and landed on this fascinating urban site, for me at least, which contains the Twin Towers Correctional Facility, which is the largest jail in the world. The Irwin C. Piper Technical Center, which houses the LAPD Air Division building, which is the largest air division for police in the world. And then finally, this block of bail bonds buildings that act as an infrastructural network that supports those two entities. And so I decided to get in close to these things, and that's where these banks of videos come from, taking a very close look at some of these surfaces, some of these back-ended faces, and starting to think about what sort of intervention or new patterning can be introduced to these places that might produce a back end to those infrastructural networks, and create a new sort of urban pattern that might produce better outcomes for people in these areas. So that brings us to this black and white diagram that I used in our miniatures presentation, where I just drew some simple dashed lines to sort of thicken the back-ended faces of these buildings. From there, it became a process of wondering, like, how do you create more of a pattern? How do you start delineating programmatic elements? And that became a series of examining dashed lines and how they might overlap with saying some programmatic elements get spaced in a certain way, and thinking about how those can create a new pattern for the city. The specific programs that I'm thinking about is a dance conservatory coupled with a larger field of vegetative space as a way to produce a very tight corridor in a way of making a better space for our city. And from there, I've been working with various things like careful documentation of these spaces through milling projects, which serve as a backdrop for cast models that begin to describe what these spaces might start to become and start to look like. And then finally, on the bottom right, there's a little video of my current model in progress that is beginning to think about things being thick or thin, and how they start to break up some of these back-ended surfaces. And I think I'll leave it there so we can have a conversation in detail.
Super.
All right, do I take over? Thank you, Rob. Okay, does everyone see my Miro board? a little closer than they're seeing it on their own screen, I guess. Okay, yeah, my project is entitled Curb Appeal, which stems from this notion of curb appeal. I think we're all familiar with curb appeal. It typically refers to the image of the single family home from the vantage point of the street. And it's a notion that has historically represented a status of individuality with respects to the home and property, but is since more used as a evaluation tool for like the economic potential of the home today. So in my case, curbed appeal is kind of the denial of that frontality, but maybe more importantly, the denial of the kind of familiar consolidation of space that's used to market homes that we're most familiar with, be it Airbnb or anything like that. So I looked at projects in my precedent that kind of produced a certain tension through denying that typical totality, whether it be denying frontality, like I mentioned, using the tectonic as a cultural representation, or just denying a totality through the sensibility of the parts themselves. Initially, in starting the thesis, I always wanted to address the typology of the subdivision in a single family home, for fact that it was always cookie cutter in its approach to vernacular as well as property land use, this kind of idea of flipping homes and the tectonic redundancy associated with that. So I chose this kind of zombie subdivision to place my new houses. The zombie subdivision kind of colloquially refers to these arrested states of development in subdivisions. This one that you're looking at here is particularly in Florida. These Lehigh Acres sites, these abandoned subdivisions, zombie subdivisions, are these wonderfully rewilded sites, sites of difference and variation, just in themselves deny the frontality of the curb right off the shelf, really. And it was a great site to propose kind of this new consolidated image between site and building. And in these diagrams, well, not really diagrams, but more drawings, you start to see how that autonomy and tethering of typical building pieces now incorporate or inhabit a site of difference and completely deny a totality or frontality. Okay, that's all I got.
Okay, hi everyone. My name is Fatima. In my project, I was trying to design one as public space that has cultural and social qualities. My site is in a city, it's a historical city in middle of Iran. It's called Isfahan. Based on this a study on the city and this historical places, I found some interesting quality in some bridges that in city that have some spaces that people use it just for gathering, resting, walking, and singing. Based on that, I was designing one pattern for one tower. That pattern come from one historical plan and arranged based on the similarity between spaces and character, and based on diagramming of microchip of Cara McCarthy. And based on that, I designed two thick facades for urban space, that each of the space has own quality, own circulation, and they are connected to one government office. And these are miniature models. So my project actually one thick urban space for public that is placed in front of government offices. That's it.
All right. I'm gonna jump into it as well. All right, everyone can hear me properly?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. Sometimes my mic doesn't like to function. So hi, I'm Lorenzo. So for my thesis, I've been working on this idea of blankness and what it means for architecture. So I've been trying to define specific techniques and positions where architecture can exist in a blank situation. So it's essentially designed emptiness that contains it, essentially, but at the same time also knows its place to be in the background. So essentially, I'm using layers and using it as a singular mass or simple mass, much like to kind of produce an object that is continuous and doesn't have components. So the layers within the mass represent an alternative to the parts, producing a kind of differentiation without fragmentation. And so the layers end up being contiguous so for example, a rock may be layered and it's still self-consistent internally, even if it's extracted or excavated. And so that's the process that I'm using for the massing. And then the idea of lights, doors, and windows and technical objects and so on are kind of considered enemies of blank space because they represent the module and the mass-produced component and industrialization, and they bring unnecessary complexity to what should be subtle space. And so these kind of architectural elements and things end up being embedded into the space to produce kind of an idea of spatial blankness. So for now, the project is kind of still in a research state. You can see some objects. So it's a chair that is consistent and blank, or stairs that are still a work in progress as well, that are completely embedded into the wall and into the floor. You can see the miniature model, which has evolved a little bit, and some facade studies. So in the end, the objective is to produce an object that is complete. Julia, if you could mute yourself.
Yeah, sorry, Lorenzo, your screen is just stuck on a Google Doc. It's not the Miro board.
Uh-oh. Why? I keep sharing screen one, screen two. Oh, okay, my screens have switched. Is this better?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you so much. And so for now, I'm working on a building that essentially is all public space, and I'm using that as a kind of place to research and develop the techniques that will eventually lead to the final project. But yeah, that's it. Thank you.
Thank you to everybody. And now we just open it up to a discussion. So jump in, ask each other questions, etc.
I have a weird suggestion for Andrew's thesis. Like, what if you presented it on Zillow?
Well, you know,
you have to do that anyway.
I know, because like these 21 ways of improving curb appeal and all that you see on YouTube, or yeah, it's kind of, it needs that kind of low culture quality or something. Yeah.
Yeah, Andrew, I love your title.
Thank you.
I think that's clever. I wanted to ask kind of what you think is like the benefit of being anti-frontal. Like, what is kind of like the spatial thing that you're getting out of not being oriented towards the street?
Can you say that for the benefit of what?
Being non-frontal, like not being oriented to the street.
I think in one way it's a land use thing. I mean, it really, you know, if you look at these existing zombie subdivisions, they're quite beautiful in terms of this kind of pincushion of like varying ecologies, you know, and so there's a lot of difference there. So it's really, in order to not clear cut a site, but that there's so much difference that how can this like type 5 tectonic occupy sites of difference, because slab on grade or that kind of approach really needs to have just that flat site. It kind of needs to be clear cut. So it's, in a political sense, it's kind of that, or to really just deny the ego or the 4-car garage or standards of living and reincorporate qualities of living. Denying a standard, yeah.
Andrew, are you proposing any changes to the site itself, or just placing the building or your design in this existing like subdivision of the landscape?
Yeah, well, there's I guess if there's one thing, I mean, on a prosaic sense, there would be some sort of case on. I stopped thinking about how they meet the ground in terms of, does the models look like they have a base? So they really are indifferent to the ground itself, but there would be like caissons or something to hold them up or whatever, to really hold them up off the ground. So no, I wouldn't edit the site at all. But that's not to say that there's kind of a mixing and matching. If you look, I mean, I've developed kind of 5 different houses in terms of scale, in terms of height and stuff. They all have a little bit different character to them. So you can kind of mix and match them in the site. So the site produces a difference and the project itself produces a difference, and you kind of have a multi-combinational thing going on between them. So it's important not to edit the site.
So the zombie subdivision, which I think is a great term, that I love that. That's just, you're using that because it's void of any typology already. So
well, there is. I really wanted to operate on the terms of some sort of existing condition or something, and I really loved this kind of infinite quality of the grid, and then the infinite quality of the forest itself, and that there's a really different on street level kind of phenomenal quality to it. So really, the site leaves everything behind, nothing behind but the curb. It's simply just the curb there. I'm not trying to turn it into a fantastical project, you know. It's just bizarre. I mean, that there's kind of a rawness and a precision to the roads and forests. Yeah.
Andrew, I love these renders that you have of the top-down look at the house woven into the forest, the existing forest. Can you speak more to that? Like, is that the strategy in your mind that is, what are you trying to achieve with that? Is it like cohesion? Is it something to, is that the approach that leaves it the most unchanged? Like, let the forest be with the forest and the house comes up around it? What's going on there?
Yeah, you know, well, it's like, so I didn't want it to be a deconstructivist project towards just totally fragmented. There is a retention of massing there, but you would never really see the project by itself naked without the forest. You know, I think it really, the project itself has some sort of a loose consolidation that was just appropriate. So it's really more to say that the project kind of has a weird boundary to it that doesn't necessarily define the interior and the indoor quality itself. You know, I don't think it's just conveniently placed more than, I'm really trying, I was working specifically with CLT, you know, and then what's kind of an off-the-shelf part that I can, I really wanted to work with a drawing that kind of worked with the sensibility of the CLT, and then how do I layer back in indexically the other type 5 parts. And so it just kind of creates a weird boundary that doesn't necessarily, what do you say, like it doesn't demark where the actual inside is. Mm-hmm. So, you know, so you're not just sitting in air conditioning all day. It was like the picture like from Airbnb of just like a bathroom or something. Like it's just so one or the other or something. And so we're so familiar with these consolidated images, you know, that. And really the forest goes from coniferous to deciduous, undergrowth, understory, canopy. They're really great.
Lorenzo, I wanted to ask, did you go, because I'm looking at your miniature model, have you moved from a kind of like more of a shape to a box?
Yeah, it turns out that the more complex it is, the harder it is to kind of create this idea of blankness. So it's not that an object can be complex, it's just that the overall massing as a kind of a simple dumb box tends to kind of fill the backgrounds and stay back than something a bit more complex as it was in miniatures.
Yeah, that's kind of what I was wondering, because there's a kind of this tension of like a highly designed object also trying to be blank. So I think it's interesting to the idea that you're kind of like defeating all of the components, that it's like one continuous surface. Is that right?
Yeah, actually the kind of the inspiration for it was the window I have in my bedroom. It's that typical white framed window that you can buy in any Home Depot and so on. And they're pretty bad, and they're in most of the new developing buildings. So this idea of killing the component is really to kind of try and get rid of that ugly aspect that I think a lot of buildings nowadays have because of industrialization and so on. So in a way, I'm trying to return a little bit to the more custom building that you used to have in the back days, but still be something that is produced nowadays. I don't know how I'm going to solve this tectonically. It's still going to be a challenge. I do want to try and solve it, but yeah, for sure.
I was going to add, oh, sorry.
No, go ahead.
I was actually going to ask something similar. I was wondering kind of like where you were starting with these components, and if it was the components that were then affecting the architecture, or if you kind of had an idea of like this blank space originally, and then the components kind of affected. I guess I was just wondering about the organization of thought.
So I think the idea as is, it's more about the architectural elements like stairs and windows and so on, and try and have them still be functional in the space, but at the same time as embedded into the architecture. So for now, what I'm doing is I'm not really thinking about stairs and windows and doors and so on, and I'm just creating space without them. And then later on, I'm embedding them into the architecture by smoothing it out and making sure that it's not a distinguishable outside object that has been just mashed or cut or bullied into it. I did a test, I'm not very happy with it, of the stairs where they kind of just flow into the wall, but I think that's kind of the direction where I'm going for now.
Hey Lorenzo, I think it's really thought-provoking, your statement on your Miro board. Blankness is the production of space that allows for dash to happen. And I was wondering how you would go about designing architectural elements with the blank that the public can fill into it.
So for now, the way I see it is, the way I go about it is by not designing the architectural elements and by having them kind of push out of the walls and the ceilings and the floors. So in a way, I'm trying to avoid to have to design a window. I'm trying to avoid it. Of course, it's kind of impossible, but I think that's the idea for now.
And the spaces for the public to occupy however they want to. Is that right?
Yeah, so for now, this is more of a test bed than anything else. The idea is until midterm, I have a site, it's in Osaka. It's kind of a reply to the World Expo in 2025. And so the idea is to make this public building that is kind of like a street, a street in the sense that a street doesn't really end up having program, it just is space and you can use it as you want it. But after midterm, the idea is to use the techniques that I developed so far and apply them to perhaps architectural typologies like a house. but it's still, you know, I'm still seeing what's going to happen for now.
Shri, hi. I love that about your project. It's constantly performing and interacting with passersby. And I was wondering if there's like a trail. If there's like a start and an end point to all the ephemerality.
Well, that's something that I've definitely thought about. All of the pieces aren't quite made yet, so the answer is you can go both ways. Currently, there's not like a specific path, but yeah, like it could potentially have sort of like a trail. I guess like one of the things about these ephemeral things, it's like it's not like it's only like up during specific times of the day and down in specific times of the day. So it's not like when a person passes through, it's like popping up. It's not like human responsive. It's more like maybe in the day it's popped up and at sundown, or maybe in the day it's like collapsed, and at sundown it pops up, and then you sort of experience the space in a new light.
Shri, can you speak a little bit more as to how you're treating some of these surfaces, where I think it's really interesting. In one place you'll have a illustration of a landscape, and then it's up against some terrazzo or a repeated floral print in a maybe like a enlarged domestic space. Mm-hmm. And I'm just wondering like what you're thinking about with that process and how it's shaping your project.
So I guess to answer that, I can specifically talk about like one of the pieces. So every piece, like I said, like there's 5 pieces. So every piece has a name and sort of a function. So it's like the confessional, which is in the top part, is basically, it's kind of defining what a confessional space is, and not necessarily defining it within the realm of like, oh, like a confessional space in a church, but in like a more broader perspective where like, if it's in the comfort of your own home, like some of these plates could, you know, sort of portray like the domestic elements of a home. So like a cabinet, you know, with like wallpaper of a home, versus like if you're in the wilderness, you're lost in your own thoughts. So one of the plates kind of portray the sort of like a wilderness attitude, versus one of it's like the Brooklyn Bridge. It's like a vast space to walk and you clear your head. So things like that. And also, but all of these things that pop up are two-sided. So there's like a story being told on each side. And depending on like the broader dialogue of what the space is supposed to do, it changes. So like for the playground, for example, like the idea of like being in Times Square and being amongst a lot of people, like the sort of playful hustle and bustle of Times Square, New York, versus like reflecting that on a theatrical stage. And like what, like that sort of attention that or dialogue or conversation that it generates. I don't, did I answer your question? I guess I just straight up.
No, you did. That's great.
Okay.
You know, Rob, I was going to say about yours, I kind of really like how you're kind of subtly trying to incorporate an intention into this kind of total blind spot that we have in cities. Like I'm thinking, like, have you ever read City of Courts? There's a Mike Davis book. I think that would be something.
Yeah, the quintessential LA book.
Yeah, of course. Well, so that's a quintessential LA book, of course, but it really is typical of almost age of cities and location of cities. I know Oklahoma City has the same condition, you know, the kind of bail bond neon lights and the big scary jail right there. And it really is this universal blind spot in cities that I think you really put your finger on. And I didn't know, I mean, it doesn't seem altogether ad hoc either, you know, what you're doing, particularly with your models. So is there something intent? Like, is there something you could put your finger on in terms of what's most consistent, like whether it be the posts or a materiality or?
I think what I'm trying to get with consistency is being able to design at two scales. The first is, I think, touches on what you're just saying, where these things are everywhere. And so that scale is kind of an impossible sort of thing to wrap your head around as far as what we might traditionally think as an architectural project. And then the other scale is the very close as to, you know, for me, it's lining these streets. So that's about like 10 to 13 feet. There's some more leeway going back and forth. So it's a very tight thing when you actually get down to designing the specifics. And it's a very large thing when you're thinking about the idea as a whole. And so by necessity to, you know, bring those two things together, there has to be a consistency of how do you repeat something like this throughout these back-ended areas, which is where the idea of the pattern comes in for me, is how do you come up with a pattern that you can then go into at the small scale, but also reapply at the larger scale. So a goal is to have these things seem like they're dashes or the repeated objects with specific variations in their place that their physical occupation is performed, but it's also something that is clearly part of a larger network. An easy analogy might be to think of like how lifeguard stations are repeated objects across a beach. And, you know, it's a single object, but also part of a larger consistent whole.
Yeah, but I don't know. I think these between courthouse and bail bond spaces are insidiously isolated and want to retain that blind spot. I mean, you can say it's a friendly accident all across the city, but particularly here, I think it wants to be a blind spot. It doesn't want to be exposed because it's this civil affect. You know, everything else is civil engineering to some degree that produces this affect, but this is kind of a civil engineering in the courts that really, I think, wants to be hidden or something. You know, it's not. I think that's interesting. I don't know.
It's a good point. I don't know that it wants to be hidden. I think by its nature, it already is hidden in the way that most infrastructure is hidden, just because we're used to it. It's just something that through habituation and exposure, we just don't really think about all that much. So while it's not trying to be a monumental thing, it is also something that I want to be known about, and I want it to draw attention to certain places. So it's a difficult proposition. It's something that I still really haven't, you know, worked out in my own mind about how that is instantiated and how do you design for that. But the idea that it is consistent and it's something that can be seen as part of a larger network is an important point.
Rob, I was wondering what you think about in terms of the network of like pedestrian versus car. Because it's like on one hand, you're talking about it being like really dispersed. I mean, not that you would go to one and then the other, but like, have you been thinking about it in terms of like the pedestrian versus the car relationship to these pavilion
Oh,
things?
yeah, absolutely. Like that definitely plays into this idea of it being so close to the street and what are some of the limits as to that relationship. Like how close can you put some of these elements to the street? How much can you move into the street without it totally disrupting the function of that piece of infrastructure? Like, how do you keep the road able to flow while also bringing in something like a miniaturized dance conservatory? And how do they react? How do you have a level of protection for the people occupying that space while also not completely shutting down the street and saying, well, this thing's going to be here and everything has to change around it? It's a problem of limits in my mind. and there are already things that serve those purposes, like crosswalks and speed bumps and other systems that are in place that negotiate that relationship between pedestrian and car. And so those are sort of the tools that I'm looking at as ways of thickening or thinning that space.
Yeah, I think the focus on the tools is really interesting, and like, because I think you could like dial it to like a really, really specific level. Because I mean, as a personal anecdote, as someone who lives in LA without a car, one of the things that was craziest to me, I realized, is that I think they're called like bag buttons, the buttons that you press to cross the street to get the light to change. Like in New York, they're a placebo, like they never make the light change any faster. But in LA, if you don't press them, the light will never change.
Right.
But recently, because of coronavirus, they got rid of them. Like now it actually just changes for the pedestrian so that we don't have to press the button. So there's like a level of like, I think that there's like a real possibility for these things to have that kind of like level of interaction, and like the specific negotiating of like how much of the street it takes could be really interesting.
Yeah, that's definitely the territory that I'm looking at right now.
I think that's really like, there's an interesting parallel kind of between, well, all four of these projects, right? There's kind of a couple, these couplets, but certainly the last two that we talked about, Sri's and Rob's, seem to have like, it's all about this sort of sequence of experiences, right? These like, it's about these combinations of things that are consequential to each other, but not necessarily consequential to the street, or the street isn't necessarily consequential to the thing itself in like an interesting way. But I wonder about the actual, like, Sri and Rob both, like who you're kind of talking about to like perceive or engage these things that this like sequence of experiences that you're putting out. Like, if is it the body walking through that is like perceiving with their eyes this sort of like, you know, spatial experiences, or like, is it like, what kind of sensual experience is there that you're sort of like proposing? But also really, who is your audience, or who is your user? And I ask that because Rob, yours specifically is also kind of like, you've chosen to be around this huge jail system, which most recently I heard really like heartbreaking and powerful sort of like anecdote of someone telling a story of a protest that they attended that went around the jail. And they paused by the jail for a while and were just kind of chanting and interacting with the prisoners who were inside, who were like stacked on these like really narrow windows, like 5 heads, you know, looking out the window, holding up little pieces of paper, kind of like interacting with the protesters who were outside, you know. And it was like this really powerful sort of like opportunity for engagement. And so in a way, like, that's your audience, right? Who will kind of be looking down upon these spaces.
Yeah, well, not only the people looking down on them, the families of those people who are, you know, by necessity of this incarceration system that our country has, they have to go to those bail bond places to try and get their families out of there. So that interaction between the stacked bodies in these jail cells that look out over this urban territory and the people who are related to them, how you might start having some more positive interactions in that space. Like an anecdote that I have when we were still like commuting back and forth between SCI-Arc and our homes is whenever I would be driving home late at night, there would be families on the medians with these big signs that were like directed for their family members within the prisons. So that, yeah, that's my audience, is those people, but also maybe the guards as well, like the sheriff's deputies, when they're leaving work, rather than going to the parking lot and getting in their cars and going home, maybe these are also spaces for them to go to and have an informal interaction. Like those two families interacting seems like a good thing to have mix.
Yeah, I would say for me, I mean, definitely mine is not as you know, like politically charged as yours, Rob, if I may say. But
you can say that.
I would say for me, it's more like, because there are many abandoned waterfronts in New York, which are, you know, which have come up to be prime real estate these days. You know, if you go by the Hudson, there's so many things happening right now, and it's happening everywhere in New York to sort of, you know, figure out a way to, you know, kind of address the flooding, but also like to figure out a way to kind of invigorate these empty spaces. And so kind of going off of that, that's how my project sort of started, is trying to figure out a way to design something that is for the city of New York, but also kind of addressing this problem of flooding, and how, you know, as a broader, like, because it's since I'm calling it monumental ephemera, how I can bring in an ephemeral aspect to this, you know, eventual event that might happen, and what, you know, that could mean for the city of New York. So I would say for me, it's like on a broader scale, it's for the city of New York. It's not like for any specific kind of people. It's just like if in Governor's Island, you know, there's carnivals happening, you know, in the fall or summer, and people attend that as like a social event. So it would be more like a social, you know, series of events that happen throughout the day and over a more gradual period of time. Rob, I actually had a question for you. I think it's really interesting the way you define monumentality. I guess like we do it very differently.
Yeah.
And do you want to a bit like elaborate on that? Like I'm looking at like your model photos, and it's really interesting to see is that sand or what is that?
Which
material? It's on the bottom right. It's your model. It's the pink foam model, and then you have two.
Oh,
and then
yeah. Those are cast dirt models, a dirt wax mixture. And then on top of the mill, that's just like the leftover high density foam material that is pulled out of it. Yeah, the question of what is monumental is a really interesting one, and perhaps subjective, as you just pointed out. Maybe we have different ways of defining it. I guess one of the qualities might be a certain sense of largeness, or persistence in our collective perception of what's in our city. There's an aspect to it that has maybe a traditional sense of it, like a huge monumental face with classic proportions that have a discrete meaning for what they're projecting into the city. So if you think about like a traditional courthouse that has a monumental presence and a monumental idea of what it does for a city and a system of power that it conveys. So that's the sort of thing that I would most readily associate with this monumentality. What about you? Do you have like a set definition?
No, I think for me, it's more like definitely when I was, you know, sort of trying to figure out the title, I had a really big conversation with Eric about like monumentality versus monumental, and how calling something like monumentality is a very like politically charged statement, so keeping it monumental is more neutral. And I guess for me, like it's more like definitely like elements of like ancient architecture, like, you know, in a lot of my projects, like or in a lot of these follies, there's like these series of colonnades of like, you know, Roman or Corinthian columns, or like having some sort of like something from the past that has stayed till now, I guess. So in a way, like, yes, like some qualities are also similar to yours with like the element of largeness and like consistency, but yeah. And I think that's how I'm looking at monumentality, certain pieces of monuments that refer to monumental things.
Well, to follow up on that then, like the idea of something from the past being brought into the present, and that is something that solidifies it as a monumental piece. Can you project to like 100 years from now? Is there anything that you might consider from our contemporary moment that then would take on those qualities and be considered as a monument in the future?
That's an interesting thought. I mean, as we progress, right, like there are certain things from the past that we always look back to. So I'm sure, like, I don't know, like 20 years down the line, we might think like the computer is a monumental thing. I don't know if AI takes over. I don't know, that's an interesting thought. Yeah, I don't know, I don't have an answer to that.
Fatima, I'm glad that you got your Miro board up now, because I had wanted to talk about the patterns in the extraction that you are working with. They're producing these really beautiful facades. And I was wondering if you could speak more to how you're thinking about these thick surfaces and their interaction between pattern and how they translate into the architectural element.
These pattern and this facade actually connected to, it's going to be part of government offices, and they all kind of, all spaces kind of connected together by stairs. And also like a whole, there is like a corridor into all spaces that connect all of them together, but in one side. The other side is going to be, the facade is going to be a sheer facade, just as a facade for, is not going to be functional. Mm-hmm. It doesn't have any programming and accessible. Just one side that is faced to river is going to be accessible. And I don't know if I answered the question or not.
I think it did. Maybe a follow-up to that is, as it is now, it seems to be a pretty graphic study in terms of it, you know, these black and white drawings. Have you thought about materiality at all up until this point? Like, how do you take something that is a black and white series of figures and turn it into the building that you are conceiving?
Not yet. Actually, the big problem of mine is the materiality and how can I just translate this one to the building. And so far I'm just designing the facades and how I can connect them together, because the most problem is the space in between. It's because it looks like a sandwich, two facade and one space in between. So maybe for next steps, I was working on that one. For now, I don't have any idea. Actually, it's a big question for me too.
Have you tried making this out of different materials at all?
Not really.
I only ask because it seems like the model is really moving you forward, right? Like the model is really the thing that sort of advanced your understanding of this thing. You have these beautiful drawings that you sort of translated that like sort of start to ask these functionalist questions, right? Like what kind of tooling are you using, or what is the materiality of the thing itself? So I wonder, like, if you have any other experiments that maybe led you to like a different understanding of the facade or the sort of space behind it.
Not designing is not completed yet, actually, and for the facade, actually, because facade is not just a facade, it's a critique facade and it has a function and is a public space. It's a program, but it doesn't have program. So I don't know how can I explain it. But if I understand it as a material, you mean the material is like a material or just?
Not specifically about the material, but the sort of like process by which you're making any of these things. So it's not necessarily that like the foam, I wouldn't say that like, you know, the foam's, you know, sort of softening quality like is giving you anything. It's more like how this thing with CNC is delivering you a different understanding of the sort of the design that you did and before that, right? So it's like it's about like what is the different instantiations of these things and how are they advancing an understanding of the kind of space making that you're talking about.
These are 3D prints I painted. These are not foam. Yeah.
Well, they're beautiful.
Yeah. Just but for all things, I wanted to have something like for building, because it's going to be so for the flat city, it's going to be so I don't know. It's a big building power for a flat city, so it's going to be monument that people can look at it. I wanted to have something that is just has a material and then like a toy things, like shimmery things or something like this. Or for the back space, I want to have something like because it's explores like ambiguity and transparency at the same time. Maybe I just follow these things for the next steps.
Fatima, it's really fascinating how your building rests on these two crane legs. Can you talk a little bit about why you've decided to lift the whole program in the air?
Because I said this building is for flat city, and all the building around this is just not high, and I wanted to be this one like floating into the city, not be at the same level of other buildings. Yeah, and there's two of them are cores and one of them are the leg of the part of the building.
Hi guys, so I think that now I'm back on this. Fateme, I think that, are you okay with all the final comments? I don't know if I guess that everybody, Anna told me that most of you got all the feedback. So I think that with that, we will close up our live chat. Please remember to go, I don't know, Faris, is the other group finished? Will we gather in one room, or if they're not finished, I think we can close this room.
I think they're all still there now. Yeah. Do you want me to close the rooms?
But not if they're talking, like we're not like,
I mean, I can broadcast a message, but they can't respond to me.
No, I think it's okay. I think that we'll say that, you know, I think we close this room and then they can, you know, they can finish whenever they finish. So we don't interrupt any conversation. So, you know, as just a note is that, remember to join us tonight at 5 o'clock for Fridays at 5. I think it's been sent already to everybody, but there's going to be a group of faculty. I don't know, Julian is there or who's from Student Union. So I think that they'll have, you know, you guys will have that, you should join tonight. And for the rest, for the model tops, we're going to send an email right now so people can pick it up tomorrow. Okay?
Thank you, Florencia.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you, everyone.
Later.
Bye.
Bye, everybody. Thank you.
And you know why it was applied to where it was.
Mm-hmm.